So let's talk about theories as to why these cycles might occur. To some extent, these theories, or in certain cases, I should say, these theories help us think about what we might do to either prevent them or what we might do policy-wise once one has started. Starting off with the classical theory, so this was the theory that was extant in the late 1800s on into the early 1900s, prior to the Great Depression, which started in 1929. There was no macro theory back in those days. Some of you might be surprised to know. It was just economic theory. There was no distinction at that time between macro and micro. All of the theoretical economic models in that time had flexible prices and clearing markets, which made it hard for a person to use a model like that to show how a big recession that lasted a long time might occur. So they basically denied the existence of a business cycle, which is pretty interesting because we know that they're part of life. Their theories tended to focus much better on the long run evolution of the economy rather than short term fluctuations that we would see. So the classical theory, to recap, is basically a non theory of business cycle. Now we go to something very, very different. In 1936, John Maynard Keynes, that's almost a household name, not quite maybe, but it is a household name in the field of economics, wrote a pretty big book on economic theory that was dedicated to explaining the macroeconomy. So this was the birth of macro, by the way. It's not on the slide, but as an aside, this was the birth of macroeconomic theory and when macro and micro theories became split side by side, but split within the field of economics, right? Separate theories, one for the aggregate economy, one, the micro, is for studying the decisions of a particular consumer or a particular firm. Okay, going back to macro, so how did he build his model? So John Keynes was very highly trained mathematically, very clever guy, and so when he saw what was happening in the Great Depression in the United Kingdom, he saw the prolonged and severe unemployment. He realized he could use his mathematical training to build a model that could give rise to that, and so he did. So the way his model worked was that declines in aggregate demand could easily explain, they had like an amplifying effect. He called it a multiplier, but they had you could have some change in aggregate demand, like say investment spending drops a little bit, that would have an effect on GDP, on overall GDP that was larger, right? That's the amplification effect. And that's a key feature of his model, and it was a key way that his model could, in some sense, mimic what was going on in the Great Depression. His model argued that government authorities, the fiscal authority and the monetary authority, could actually do something. So the model kind of works in reverse in a similar way that I talked about how it explains a severe and prolonged contraction. It works in reverse in the sense that if the government, if Congress, in our case the United States, authorized some additional fiscal stimulus, say it's $100 billion, kind of using today's numbers maybe, that $100 billion gets amplified. Remember I talked about amplification that helped us explain the economy contracting. Here, because it's an increase, you get an amplification on the plus side, and it would help restore GDP. So this theory had strong proclamations for the role of government authorities in helping things out if either the economy had entered recession or if folks thought maybe it was entering or going to enter into a recession. Another very important and key part of the theory was he said labor markets don't clear. So that made sense at the time of the Great Depression and the few years after the Great Depression, where everybody was saying, wow, what happened? It was a big deal. Like I said, the classical models couldn't explain it. Labor markets in the Keynesian model would go into disequilibrium, allowing for, and they would stay in disequilibrium for a while, right? Allowing for this disconnect between supply and demand, i.e., all those unemployed people, right? So there's an excess supply of labor out there. Those people wanted to work, that's the excess supply. Firms weren't hiring them, right? That's the low side of the excess supply equation. And therefore, they were unemployed. So that's all fine and good. But you might think to yourself, okay, let me go back to the egg or the chicken, whichever one you prefer, and ask the question, well, why would aggregate demand fall in the first place? Very good question. What Keynes argued, this is his take on it, is that animal spirits. He said, people just get weird sometimes, or however you want to think of it, and they suddenly pull back on their expenditures. And you can think of that both from the point of view of households and things they're purchasing, whether it's toasters or cars or whatever they're purchasing. And you can think of it from the point of view of firms and their investment expenditures for maintaining operations or expanding their operations, right? So either way, or both of those types of economic agents could suddenly say, I'm not going to spend, I'm going to pull back on my spending, right? And then you get the amplification effect and everything else that I talked about. So the Keynesian theory is very different than classical theory in the sense that it explicitly and dramatically builds in features to explain cycles. The Austrian theory, this is quite interesting. They say cycles are natural. It's sort of connected to the workings of financial markets in the sense that they say it's human nature that you're going to have periods of good times. Say there's good times and bad times. So in good times, human psychology is that there's a complacency that comes in. And folks making economic decisions, households, firms, governments, all of the above, feel good. The economy's been expanding for a long time, and they say to themselves, I can lever up. I can take on more debt. All right, I can raise my debt to equity ratio, and it's okay. They think it's okay because it's good times. So this is a key point. So the Austrian cycle then is what happens is because there's good times, people keep adding debt relative to equity. They lever up. They continue to lever up. Well, at some point, we know that that's going to create a bubble. And at some point, once a bubble is created, we know that bubble will burst. And that's exactly part of the Austrian theory, right? They say eventually the bubble bursts, then it's bad times, then everybody gets scared, everybody pulls back on their expenditures, right, because they're fearful. Everyone all of a sudden gets religion with respect to how much leverage they want to take on, and then there's a big contraction. So this idea has been around for many, many years, since the early 1900s, I believe, but it regained popularity, quite a bit of popularity, after the recent recession. Right before the recent recession, it was pretty close to say that it had been almost forgotten. The next type of theory is, these are acronyms, RBC and DSGE. They're explained right there. The acronyms aren't particularly important, actually. These models are modern, very modern. They are artificial economies built on the computer, so it's the closest thing to a laboratory that the field of macroeconomics is ever going to get, probably. These models can be built in a variety of ways. So they initially were built where they explicitly modeled what are called supply shocks, so shocks to the country's ability to produce goods and services. But later they realized, we can bring in demand shocks too. So a demand shock is something like we were talking about in the context of Keynesian theory. Suppose consumers or households suddenly decide to pull back on their expenditures, something like that. So these models can be built with many, many different kinds of structures. And so because of that, you can get a variety of results. But these models have been used to help characterize the plethora of recessions that have occurred in the time that we have historical data for the United States economy, and I'll come to that later in sort of a summary section on what we know about cycles. So I'll keep going. Then there's a type of economic model of cycles that really doesn't fit the definition I started out with, but I think it's very interesting, and I think everyone should have this in the back of their mind when they think about their life, their portfolio, their business, their household, decisions they're making, and that kind of thing. And that is that there are long cycles. There's the Kuznets cycles, which are 15 to 20 years in duration, associated with demographic waves that are in that rough time frame of duration. Building cycles, if you go earlier in time, railroad building cycles. And then there are longer Kondratiev cycles, 50 to 60 year long cycles. Examples, just a couple of quite a few examples that have been documented, were the steel and railway revolution in the 1850s that lasted something like 80 years, the petrochemical and automobile revolution in the 1850s, which again lasted many decades. So these are things to think about. What you might think in our modern time here in 2016 is maybe there's some kind of long technology cycle going on. But because, keep in mind, I would say you can think about that, keep in mind that technology might be different than the automobile, right? And it might filter through the economy and impact things in a different way, but it might have its own cycle.